So we're going to be in 1 Kings chapter 3 tonight, and we're going to pick up with beginning in verse 16. So this is about 2 weeks ago we were in here and we got through Solomon's dream, and so now we pick up kind of what happens next. And so hopefully tonight we will make it through most of chapter 4. So let me open us up with prayer, and then we'll start into the text and read more about the early parts of Solomon's reign. Lord God, I thank you for this evening to be able to study your word. I pray that as we read it, that we would love it more. Even though we might read this and think, well, this is history, this is a story, that we would recognize that this is a story that you're telling for a specific purpose. You want to bring things out for us to hear and to read and to understand. And so, God, I pray that you would help us to understand it tonight, that even though we are 3,000 years removed from this time period, that we would walk away tonight with something that you're working on our hearts to change us, to ultimately make us look more like you. And so we pray these things in your name, Jesus. Amen. Okay, so Solomon's a young guy. He's had a dream in chapter 3. We've already begun to see that there's some interesting things about Solomon already, and yet God appears to him in a very positive way. So, what are things that we noticed? That he had, a marriage to Pharaoh's daughter. And what else did we notice about, I think I spelled Pharaoh wrong, but I've seen it both ways. A wrong and a right, I don't know.
Pharaoh.
Pharaoh, isn't it? So there you go. So there, it'll be wrong, it could be right, who knows? So there's that piece, right? Then we also find that he is, making sacrifices on the high places. And really that's kind of a statement to say that still goes on. He's not at the site of the ark to do this, and so we already begin to say, okay, there's a couple little things. They're not explicitly mentioned as bad, except for this one. The writer so far is just kind of glossing over these things. He's just telling the details about Solomon's reign, and it seems like, though, however, he's going to start out really strong. At least what we've seen already is he started out politically strong because he followed his dad's orders. So in this dream, he prays. God says, ask me whatever you want. And Solomon says, I need wisdom. And why does he need wisdom? He needs wisdom, right? Because he looks, he says, to discern right from wrong. But he says, ultimately, it's the weight of the task of leading the people. Remember what he says here is he talks about, and he says, give your servant a receptive heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil, for who is able to judge this great people of yours? And his desire is that God would make him capable and able to take on this task of leading Israel. I think there's a lot of wisdom even in that statement, that you're looking at the task that it takes to do something that God's called you to do, and you should maybe just request that God would give you the wisdom to take it on and to be able to do it. So he wakes up, God tells him he's going to give him all this extra stuff as a result. He's proud of that answer. And so he wakes up, offers these sacrifices. So we know that this was something real, though, too. Solomon doesn't just wake up and say, well, I had a dream, but really, I don't know if it was real or not. You ever had those dreams, by the way, where they've made you mad, and you wake up mad, and it might be something, you're mad at somebody because you had a dream, and they did something in your dream, but it was a dream. They had nothing to do with it. It just played out that way, and it's not real. We wake up and we say, okay, yeah, well, I know I'm frustrated, but it's fake. It's not real. It was just something weird that I was thinking of at night. The Old Testament has examples where that's kind of the norm. They're not looking under every place and saying, every time you lay down, there's a dream. The ancient Egyptians were like that. If you were to look into the ancient Egyptian culture, they were very superstitious about dreams, and they had books called like the Book of Dreams. And so you read this, and so in a book like this, it would say, if a man has a dream and he sees a bird, it means good. He will have prosperity. And then a couple pages later, if a man has a dream and he sees a bird, it means bad. You know, like, it wasn't really consistent, but they have all this stuff to try to categorize dreams. It's like something you'd see in a Christian bookstore sometime, interpreting dreams. I don't think you can do that. I don't think that's the purpose even of showing those in the Bible. But the Egyptians were all into that. But that's not the picture we get in the Bible. The picture is that we know that some stuff is just weird, and there are some real ones. But every time somebody has a real dream in the Old Testament, and in the New Testament, you don't have to look far to think of Joseph, the husband of Mary. When they wake up, there's no doubt in their mind that God has visited them and spoken with them. And so it's the same thing here. Solomon wakes up, he knows that something else was happening here. This was a special case. So here he is, he wakes up, he offers his offerings, goes to where the Ark of the Covenant is in Jerusalem, and offers more offerings there. And so we know something significant has happened. Now, it's one thing to say you've had this dream, but now let's see what the fruit is of that. And so here's where we pick up in verse 16. This is a story that if you've grown up in church, you've probably heard this, a very famous test case of Solomon's wisdom. 2 women who were prostitutes came to the king, and they stood before him. Now that's an interesting statement in and of itself, right? And there's no judgment made of that. This is the daily life of a king. He's, honey, I had these 2 prostitutes come in today, and I just, like normal, I got to figure out what they're all up about, what the problems are that we need to solve. And you might ask, what is a king settling a dispute between 2 prostitutes for? Wouldn't he have bigger things to do? Well, 2 things on that. Yeah, there's a precedent that we see, remember, in 2 Samuel 15, and it's actually started even before with Saul, but remember what happens in 2 Samuel 15. This is the gateway through which Absalom is trying to take over the kingdom. Just to remind you, what would happen in the life of David's kingdom is in 2 Samuel 15, it says this. Verse 1, Absalom got himself a chariot, horses, 50 men to run before him, and he would get up early and stand before the road leading to the city gate. When everyone had a grievance to bring before the king for settlement, Absalom called out to and asked, "What city are you from?" And if you replied, "Your servants from one of the tribes of Israel," Absalom said, "Look, your claims are good and right, but the king does not have anyone to listen to you." He added, "If only someone would appoint me judge in the land, then anyone who had a grievance or dispute could come to me, and I would make sure he received justice." And so we do see that this was something that was pretty normal in the life of the kings of Israel, at least up to this point, where people would come with a judgment. And it might be that these cases might have been a little bit too much for a local leader in the area, and so this is where we have these people come. The other thing you remember is in Deuteronomy chapter 17, we're told that the king is supposed to have written down a scroll. The ideal king is supposed to have written down a scroll of the law, and he's supposed to meditate it on day and night. And the meaning behind that is that in his decision making, he should always have the word of God in the background. And that's what you see David doing, is David is making decisions. Sometimes it sounds weird, like when he says, when his response is to Nathan, who confronts him about his sin with Bathsheba, when he talks about the man who stole the sheep. And David pulls this number about how many times this guy's got to go and pay back now that they know the sheep has been stolen. But that's actually a Torah principle about how you provide restitution. And so a king was supposed to have known the commands and be able to deal with cases from a godly, spiritual perspective. That was what the ideal king should do. So here we are once again. We're in the throne room now with Solomon, and we have these 2 prostitutes that have come in. Now this is a hard case. This is not just something that the local cop can deal with, because there's something pretty bad about this case. So it says they came in, and one woman said, "Please, my lord, this woman and I live in the same house. And I had a baby while she was in the house. And on the 3rd day after I gave birth, she also had a baby, and we were alone. No one else was with us in the house, just the 2 of us were there. And during the night, this woman's son died because she laid on him. She got up in the middle of the night and took my son from my side, while your servant was asleep, and she laid him in her arms and put her dead son in my arms. And when I got up in the morning to nurse my son, I discovered he was dead. And that morning I looked closely at him, and I realized that he was not the son that I gave birth to. No, the other woman said, my son is the living one, your son is the dead one. The first woman said, no, your son is the dead one, my son is the living one. So they argued before the king. That's a pretty difficult case. How do you know? I mean, they don't have any DNA tests. A lot of babies early on. I mean, you gotta think we're in a Jewish culture. They're gonna have the same coloring. You know, you're not gonna find someone with a blonde baby and someone with a brown hair baby. I'm gonna guess that they're all brown-haired, brown-eyed kids. Okay, that's just what they're gonna look like. So here they are. One wakes up, finds her baby dead, and she looks close and says, "This is not my baby." Now, a mom would know that. Mom would be able to tell. And so here they are. They brought this case. It seems to have gone nowhere. They bring it to the king. So everybody's fighting. They can't figure out, how do we solve something like this? So the king replied, verse 23. The woman says, "This is my son who is alive, and your son is dead." But that woman says, "No, your son is dead, and my son is alive." The king continued, "Bring me a sword." At this point, you're kind of thinking, "All right, that's weird. What do you want to do a sword with? You know, who's he going to take out? Which woman is going to get it, right? Does he know?" And then they brought the sword to the king, and the king said, "Cut the living boy in two, and give half to one and half to the other." Yeah, that's a pretty freaky thing. Yeah. It ain't pretty. Now here's what happens, verse 26, right? It says, "The woman whose son was alive spoke to the king, because she felt great compassion for her son. 'My lord, give her the living baby. Please don't have him killed.'" So we know that the narrator is telling us that the real mom is there, and she can't bear the thought of this baby ever being killed. So she said, it's better that this baby will grow up with this prostitute than to stay with this one, right? But then the other one said, "He will not be mine or you. Cut him into two." And the king responded, "Give the living baby to the first woman. Don't kill him. She is his mother." So he put the one to rest pretty quickly and figured that one out the best way. You got to think about the kind of woman who would have no problem saying, "Yeah, cut him in two. None of us are going to have a baby then." You know, but Solomon obviously has some pretty strong wisdom for that was going to flesh it out, and you're going to probably get the response out immediately from who was there. But notice what happened as a result. All Israel heard about the judgment the king had given, and they stood in awe of the king because they saw that God's wisdom was in him to carry out justice. So what has happened as a result? This is a major case, and everybody else has heard about this case now. And what people now know is that this young guy who's sitting on the throne, something's different about him. And it's very, very clear that God has his hand on him. And so that word is actually that the people feared him respectfully, that they understood that this is not someone we want to toy with. This is somebody who God is going to work through, and we can trust that he will deal with things and lead us with wisdom. That's how we get to this part. So God has definitely shown, and he's used, sometimes it takes a big event to occur to see what you're made of, and then for that to set the tone going forward, how it's going to play out. And so that's how it plays out here. This initial test case, from that moment on, people understand Solomon's got God in his corner and given him the wisdom that he needs to rule the people. Yes, sir.
So then it seems to me like there's a contrasting story that really illustrates what happens when you don't have that wisdom, and it's about Joram in 2 Kings, when the siege of Samaria is happening, and the king is walking along, and a woman comes up and says, "Look, listen, my friend and I made this deal that if we would eat my child on the first day, then the second day we would eat her child."
Yeah.
And we ate my child, and now she's hidden her child from me.
Yeah.
And Joram has no answer.
Yeah.
So it's on, and because he's not walking with God, he's not listening to God.
Yeah.
It just seems like it's that contrast to what we see in Solomon.
Absolutely. And I think Solomon has such a good start. Solomon, I think, is reading God's word. God is heavy working through him in those decisions. And so stuff like this plays out early on. And so people recognize it's a good time to be led by a wise man. Yeah. Even though he's young, he's wise. God's got his hand on him. But yeah, you see people, when they don't have, I mean, when you get past Solomon, the kind of life that happens in the story of Israel is we will get to a part at some point where they come out at some point and the priests have got this book and they're like, man, we've never seen one of these before. This is the law. Do you know we had one of these here? Like, even in the temple, they had no clue. And so you understand the word of God is gone from amongst the people, and there's the chaos that comes because there is no standard. It becomes the king's standard of what he wants and what he chooses. And so we see that right now, at least, things are starting out well. Let's look at chapter 4 now. So King Solomon reigned over all of Israel. And these were his officials. So the first person we see here is Azariah, son of Zadok, the priest. It's interesting because right off in just the earlier chapters, we talked mainly about Zadok was going to be the priest, but now in this line they start talking about Azariah, the son of Zadok. So the reason why is this is kind of a list that's been written, it appears, maybe towards the end of Solomon's reign, and telling us who has been ruling, who's been helping out. So this is a prominent individual, and it seems that really for most of Solomon's reign, it's this guy Azariah who has been the high priest. Zadok started out, but Zadok was one of David's guys. He was a contemporary of Solomon's father. And so we have this. Now here's what's also interesting, and I just want to ask you, what do you do with this? It appears, well, let me just read the words to you, and I want to ask you as a class, how do we deal with this? So 1 Chronicles chapter 6, just listen. Chronicles chapter 6, verse 8 says, and Ahitub fathered Zadok, and Zadok fathered Ahimaaz, and Ahimaaz fathered Azariah. But in here, it says, Azariah, son of Zadok the priest. What do you make of that? I just want to ask you. So in Kings, he is Zadok's son. In Chronicles, he's the grandson. Which one's right?
Being a grandmother, I could think either one of them as a son.
Okay.
I would accept either way.
Okay. Okay.
The actual father passed.
What was that?
Actual father's dead.
Okay. Could be that.
So just kind of.
Yeah. So here's what I'm going to say: is notice in the Chronicles passage I read is they did not say grandfather, because here's the thing: in Hebrew, they don't really use word grandfather at all. It's just father, and father can be grandfather. Father can be father. It just calls for the descendant. So really, I threw that up there just for fun because there is no discrepancy here at all. Because Zadok is the father of. He's ultimately the patriarch. He is the one through which Azariah comes from. Now, it does appear, though, that why not his son? Why not the Azariah's dad become the priest? So it appears that he probably did die early on, and that's why the grandson of Zadok is reigning in the place. But I do want you to realize sometimes when you read, and you read somebody is the grandson of somebody and then someone is the son of somebody, you need to recognize that when they're using the word son, it can mean son, it can mean grandson. It's not an issue. That's just how they talked. And so that's not a real discrepancy at all. I know it used to bother me as you start to read on in like Daniel, and one of the kings in there is called the son of Nebuchadnezzar, but in history he's actually the grandson. But that's not really a problem when you know the language. Of course he's Nebuchadnezzar's son. That's just what it meant to be called. You're within the line of Nebuchadnezzar, his son. And so that's what we see here. So here we are, Zadok, who was you remember there were two priests during the time. And in fact, if you look down at verse 4, Zadok and Abiathar, remember those were the two priests during David's age. And Abiathar hitched his wagon to the wrong horse. He went with the other brother. He was going to now help the other brother become the next king. And that did not play out too well. And remember, towards the end of David's reign, Solomon says, look, man, because you were priests, because you loved my dad, you were with him in the good times and the bad, I'm not going to hurt you. And you carried the Ark of the Covenant. You're a holy person. Go back to where you came from, but you're done being a priest now. And Zadok is brought in, and his line is now the line for the high priests. So we now see that going on. Now look at the next set of guys here. We find these guys now, and occasionally we just read these names and blow them off, but I found that some of these are kind of fascinating. We have Elihoreph and Ahijah. They're sons of Shisha. They're secretaries. Now, the idea of what a secretary probably meant was these were actually guys who handled local and foreign correspondence. So these are the guys who, if things are happening inside the reign, they're going to be the ones sending out the letters to the other kingdoms. They're going to send out letters to make sure things are going into the territories and the tribal areas, the regions. They're the guys who are responsible for that. Remember, we don't got telegrams. We don't have internets or texts. This is all we got. So these guys, you had to have someone who was literate, who could write down exactly what the king wanted, get it done, and send those out. Those are these guys here. So that was their job. We have Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud. He was the court historian. Now, does anybody else have a different word that they translate for him?
Recorder.
Yeah, so you'll see historian, you'll see recorder. Now, the idea is, a lot of these, we're not quite sure because we're looking into an ancient Near Eastern kingdom, and we're trying to understand how they developed and how they ruled their kingdom. So our best guess at what that recorder did, and kind of the difference between him and the secretary is this, is if the secretary are the guy sending out correspondence, the recorder is the guy who is probably writing out everything that takes place in the court, and then what those laws are going to mean and those decrees that go out and what that means for everybody else. And so he's kind of like the connection between the court and then just life in general, making sure that that gets implemented. And so he's somebody who's taking care of writing all that business down for the king. So that's what we see here. Then we see, once again, Benaiah, son of Jehoiada. He's in charge of the army. He's a pretty tough guy. He's got a priestly line. He was one of David's tough men. He was also a guy who was part of like the elite guys, but he also was in charge of this group of mercenaries that worked for David. And so he's the main guy in charge of the army. Zadok and Abiathar, they're the priests. And then I want you to notice this. Tell me what you notice about this. Azariah, son of Nathan, in charge of the deputies. And Zabud, son of Nathan, a priest and advisor to the king. What's interesting about those two individuals? What do you notice? What jumps out about these guys?
Azariah, a different one.
Okay, it's a different guy. What else do we know about what else should jump out? Is there another name that you recognize in there? Nathan. So Nathan, the prophet Nathan, has two sons. And his two sons are now at work in Solomon's kingdom. So now you see those who were good to David, who blessed David, who blessed Solomon, Solomon puts him into place. And so Nathan has obviously passed the torch. He's got two sons that come into play. So notice what his sons do. You've got the first one, who is Azariah, and we're not quite sure until you read on a little bit more. It says he's in charge of the deputies. So the deputies, at first you're like, okay, whatever, he's in charge of the deputies. Actually, he's in charge of a lot that goes on from 7 to 19. That is all of Azariah's job. So he's in charge of essentially all of the guys who were in charge of regions of Israel. He is super high up there, one of Nathan's sons. The next guy, Zabud, who is Nathan's son, says that he's a priest and an advisor to the king. So it appears that Nathan probably had some priestly line. And so he is also serving. Now, he's not the high priest, but he's serving, and he's part of a priestly family. But it also, the word, sometimes you'll see in a translation say he's a friend of the king, but it just means he's a strong advisor. So here he is, his son, Nathan's son, is brought in to be a kind of a spiritual advisor to Solomon. That's a legacy. That's somebody, sometimes with the prophets and these guys, you usually see sons that don't really do well. Both of Nathan's sons tend to be pretty strong guys who carry on that legacy. I want you to ask you, notice in this, with both of those sons, what do we not see their role be?
Say that again.
Okay, notice with both of the sons, is it something interesting? I mean, you look at some of these guys, you'll see kind of what their father did, they did, right? So obviously, there's these guys who are military guys kind of find themselves in the military. If there were guys who, obviously in the priestly line, come and they're in as priests, what do we notice about Nathan's sons that is different than what Nathan's role was? Do we know what's missing from the words about them? Maybe I'm fishing the wrong here, but I want you to see. Here's what I'm trying to get at. His sons are not called prophets. That's a big deal. They're not called prophets. Because I want you to know that the office of prophet does not exist. There is no office of prophet that gets transferred. Nobody is a prophet and then just passes that on based on their family. So Nathan, even though he's a prophet, is not somebody who's going to say, when I'm done, my son's going to be a prophet, you're going to be a prophet. That doesn't get passed on at all. Now, a priest, that's the family line, but a prophet is somebody who's getting called out of all sorts of backgrounds. We've got prophets who are called out of being shepherds. We got prophets, kings who are kings. We've got prophets who are priests. We've got prophets we don't know their background, but it does not passed on. There is no family line of prophets at all. In fact, the story of what we see are a lot of these just unknown, unnamed guys that God will select and raise up for a time to be the prophet, to bring the word of God, and that's it. We don't hear any more about them. It's not passed on. So I think it's interesting to note that Nathan's sons are not just brought in as prophet number 1 and prophet number 2. Nathan's number 1 son has got a very secular job. He's in charge of the business of the kingdom. It's a large kingdom. The other guy has got a pretty spiritual job, but he's not prophet. He's not a court prophet or anything like that. So I want you to know, as you look in this text, that's something interesting about how God uses people. That prophets are going to be selected from anywhere, and it's never passed on based on your family. Yeah?
If I understand correctly, a prophet can be a priest.
Yes.
But a king cannot be a priest. Can he not be a prophet? Because Jesus was called a prophet, priest, and king.
Yeah.
Fulfilling all three offices. God's representative to man, and man's representative to God the Father.
Yeah, so we do know, the New Testament tells us that David was considered a prophet. And he, as they're quoting some of the Psalms, they talk about David, who was a prophet. We also know that there is that interesting reference about, and a lot of that comes with Jesus being the priest, from what we see in the New Testament carried on as this order of Melchizedek.
Right.
One thing I think is an interesting thing to look into is, did David look at himself as also priestly according to the line of Melchizedek? Because there is some evidence that I kind of swayed by, that when David takes over Jerusalem, which was the city that belonged to Melchizedek, that you notice David kind of takes on some priestly roles. And so David is doing some priestly things. In fact, that's when the ark comes into place, and he's wearing these priestly robes, and he's dancing, and that's where they look down, and they see him. His wife looks down and says, what are you doing? You're making a fool of yourself. And so I do wonder if there was some of that all playing out already, that there is this separate, real Melchizedek line that priests could be part of as well. But yeah, kings could be prophets, but really, David's really the only one that we know who's mentioned as a prophet.
Right.
Yeah.
But he can't be a priest and a king.
Well,
together, can he?
To be a priest according to the line of Aaron, you had to be from Levi, and so David's from Judah. So
Right.
technically, he would not be in that line. If he is a Melchizedek priest line, as we see, that's a possibility, but not in the sense it would be completely separate from a Levite's line.
Right,
Of
but-
course, yeah.
Melchizedek is listed in the tone of Jesus because there's no record of a beginning
Uh-huh.
or an end.
Yeah. It's an interesting, it talks about how that line is, that priestly line is superior
Right.
because of the tithe that Abraham gives. It's a great little section in Genesis when that happens. Good questions there. All right, let's keep moving. I want to show you a couple other things in these guys. So we find out we have Ahishar, who's in charge of the palace. Now, the Solomon's palace is about to become a big deal. It's going to take a long time to build it because it is going to be awesome. Bigger than what David had made and had before. And then we have a guy named Adoniram, and then notice what it says, son of Abda, in charge of forced labor. Now, what that means is, you'll see a lot of projects are about to start. And this is the guy who is going to go in, and people are going to be forced to build those things for Solomon. Now, it was going to be not only filled with Israelites, as you'll see as we read the next set of verses, it's going to be filled with a lot of these other kingdoms that have submitted to Israel. They're called vassal states, that they have said, we don't want to fight you, we want to exist, we will support you, we will pay tithes to you, we will pay taxes to you, we will send you whatever, but we want to coexist, we don't want to be wiped out. And so those kingdoms that did that, that's where you get a lot of the forced labor from as well. All right, let's move just a few minutes and let's see what's going on here. Verse 7. Solomon had 12 deputies for all Israel, and they provided food for the kingdom, his household. Each one made provision for 1 month out of the year, and these are their names. So he's going to list these 12 individuals, and these are the guys who it was their job for each month. They were to collect from their region all the supplies that would be needed to support the government in Israel. What would be to support the centralized government in Jerusalem. So we'll kind of rush through these names because there's not a ton there, but I want to point out just a few things. It says Ben-Hur in the hill country of Ephraim. That's not Ben-Hur from the movie Ben-Hur, just to remind you. Different guy. Ben-Decker in Makaz. Shalbim, Beth Shemesh and Elon Beth Hanan. Ben-Hesed in Arabah. He had Sukkah in the whole land of Hefer. Ben-Abinadab in all of Nephath, Nephath Dor. Taphath, daughter of Solomon, was his wife. Now, sweet. This guy was a son-in-law of Solomon. So he married one of Solomon's daughters, and he's one of the 12 regional governors of the empire. Must be a nice gig. So he's got this area. Now, keep reading. We don't know who these people are. These were significant, obviously, during the reign of Solomon, but there's not much about these people that we know. Banah, son of Ahilud, in Tanakh, Megiddo, and all Bethshean, which is from beside Zarethan, below Jezreel, from Bethshan to Abel Meholah, as far as the other side of Jokmeam. Ben-Geber, Ramoth Gilead, he had the villages of Jair, son of Manasseh, which are in Gilead, and he had the region of Argob, which is in Bashan, 6 great cities with walls and bronze bars. Must have been a big city is what he's talking about. It's a big deal. Abinadab, son of Edo, in Mahanaim. Ahimaaz in Naphtali. He had married the daughter of Solomon, Basemath. So here we are, another one that has married a daughter of Solomon. And significant that this guy is another significant guy that Solomon's put into place. Banah, son of Hushai, and Asher, and Baaloth, Jehoshaphat, son of Parah, and Issachar, Shimei, son of Eli, and Benjamin, Geber, son of Uri, in the land of Gilead, the country of Sion, and the Amorites, and the king of Og of Bashan. And there was one deputy in the land of Judah. Okay, so before we close, because we're almost at close, I want you to notice a couple things about this here. 2 son-in-laws. What do you notice about the region? Are you able to make out, do you notice any names in these regions that stand out? Because remember, Israel is made up of 12 tribes. They come and they take the land, and their regions are based on where their tribes are from. When you read this list, guess what? There are only 6 regions that are associated with one tribe, which tells us that when Solomon came into power, he kind of carved things up differently. Solomon was not going to let the old ways play out. Solomon decided that, things have been too fractured, so what I'm going to do is I'm actually, instead of going to say, so here's a terrible map for you, once again, this is Cyprus here, this is Israel, this is Dead Sea, all right? And let's just pretend, right, for the sake of argument, here's where this tribe went, here's a little one that went there, and that one got that, and there was that one on that side, and so it kind of looks like this, right? So let's just imagine that is as accurate of a map you could ever get. Just don't look in the back of your Bibles right now. What Solomon has essentially done is he said, okay, here's region 1, here's region 2, here's region 3 and 4, and some of them he kept. Judah had its own special status. But what he does is he changes things up. He's running it different. It's no longer, it's a united kingdom, and these old rivalries of kingdoms are gone. He forces them to kind of work together because they're based on regions now and not so much tribes. So that's one of the big changes that Solomon has. In fact, what you'll see later on is, and we've already begun to see that the break apart is occurring, that there's north versus south, and they've all kind of turned into a blob. There's like 2 in the south, and then there's 10 in the north. But that's what's going on here. He's carved things up a little bit the way he wants to. And then what we also see is Judah seems to have special status in all of this. Judah's singled out, and that's one thing that's always stuck with people, is they've always felt like, why does Judah always get the best? Well, Judah has always been the best. Judah has always been supposed to be the leader and to be the one of prominence. And that stays that way even in where the kingdom's at, because that was the local area. Jerusalem was in Judah. And so that's how it carves out. So we're done tonight because I have to run upstairs to talk to the team kids, and we're also at our time. So next week we will continue on. We'll finish up 4, and then we're off that next Wednesday, because that's the Wednesday right before Rock the Block. And so next week we're on, though. We'll be here Wednesday. We'll finish 4 and move on. But as we close, I want you to be thinking about, just continue to think about, this is a big deal. And remember, there's a young guy who's coming in, and he's having to restructure everything, and he's trying to run this as best. And here's what you don't recognize, and we'll see it actually in the next set of verses. Israel that Solomon is ruling extends out to here. I know I'm probably off camera, but it extends out to here. The people who are serving them in the empire of Israel is much larger than just Canaan. And so here you have a brand new guy. He's young. He's probably got to be a little insecure, because even right before he's even reigned, he's tried to be yanked out of his hands. But we know that at the very beginning, God told him, ask what you want, and Solomon said, help me to do this. And so what we do see in these early chapters is God helps him and gives him everything that he needs to do it the right way. But we're about to see that it's already continuing to fracture a little bit, because Solomon's not going to keep up with that. But I do think as we leave, think about this. Have you asked God to give you the wisdom that you need to take on the task that he's called you to do? Maybe there's a ministry that you're about to get involved with, and maybe you're nervous about serving in that way. Maybe someone's asked you to make a commitment to help out with something, and you look at yourself and you say, there's no way I can do this. There's no way that I'm qualified. But have you just asked that God would just provide you with the wisdom to take it on each day and to live that out? And so I think as we walk away from that today, recognize that God will give you that. We're told to ask anything. And if we lack wisdom, the book of James tells us, he'll give it to us. And so that's what we should be praying for. So let me close this in prayer, and then I'm going to jet out, and then we'll have about a 5-minute break. Colby is going to run prayer meeting tonight. I have prayer sheets available, but that's what we're going to do. So let me close this in prayer, and then we'll be done.